On behalf of Product and Development Technology Station, welcome to BioAfrica Convention.
Located at the Central University of Technology of Free State in the city of Roses, Bloemfontein, South Africa, the Product Development Technology Station, otherwise also known as PDTS, is an innovation hub. We take new existing ideas and convert them into products. We have a team of creative and skilled professionals with more than 2 decades of experience. Our services have been developed specifically to provide assistance to clients, innovators, and entrepreneurs with a variety of solutions and concepts to effectively get their ideas to the market. As a technology station within the Technology Innovation Agency, also otherwise known as TIA, we provide a comprehensive product development service. Some of the advanced machinery used at the technology station that enable us to do our work include the CNC pipe bender, the CNC pipe laser cutter, the CNC turn mill, the 3-axis milling machine, 5-axis milling machine, and a CNC wire cutter.
Welcome to this short workshop of Introduction to Medical Device Product Development Processes. My name is Mzwakhe Moqhaisa, and I will be presenting this workshop of Thabo Lenkwe and Carol Plecker. This workshop will cover the following: overview of medical device product development, overview of mass manufacturing technologies and characteristics of manufacturing process, a case study on patient-specific dynamic handspring by additive manufacturing, a case study on sustainable wheelchair and rugby wheelchair, commercialization and opportunities of medical device in South Africa, an overview of product classifications and product registration in South Africa, including international overview of ISO 13485, introduction to intellectual property and IPR Act. Here at PDTS, we use a technology readiness level chart to define the different stages in product development. Tier level 0, that's an idea. Tier level 1, that's a basic research. Tier level 2, that's technology formulation. Tier level 3, that's a validation of needs. Tier level 4, that's a small scale prototype. Tier level 5, that's a large scale prototype, a prototype that is tested in the intended environment. Tier level 6, that's prototype system. It's a prototype that is tested in the intended environment close to the expected performance. Tier level 7, that's demonstration system, a prototype operating in the operational environment at pre-commercial state. Tier level 8, first of a kind commercial system, where all technical processes and systems to support commercial activity are in ready state. Tier level 9, that's a full commercial application, a technology on general availability for all customers. That's basically now where a product is on the shelves, available for all customers. Before we begin with the development process, let's define a medical device. In simple terms, nothing technical. A medical device is any device intended to be used for medical purposes. Medical devices benefit patients by helping healthcare providers diagnose and treat patients, helping patients overcome sickness or disease, improving quality of life. And a product development is a way of understanding the processes for designing and developing medical device products that meet and exceed customer needs and requirements. By customers, it could either be a patient, innovator, or an entrepreneur. Now let's have a bird's eye view of the development process. The process consists of a business case, design control or design history file, and a technical file. Now broken down into stages, stage 1 to 6, stage 1 being your initiation or feasibility study, which is mostly accompanied by a risk assessment. Stage 2, concept. Stage 3, design and development, which includes verification and validation of the design. Stage 4 is the design transfer, mostly referred to as transfer to manufacturing. Stage 5 is your regulations, and stage 6 is the launching of the product. In this workshop, I will be showing you the medical device product development processes. I will be covering some important concepts you need to know to develop a medical device. This will include things such as intended use, user needs, design input, design verification, design validation, and design transfer. This is a good start for medical device product development design control. It covers requirements on how to develop a medical device. Design control is a regulatory requirement. The regulations will be discussed at the later stage of this workshop. Working with design control is an effective way of designing a medical device that is safe and meets the customer needs. That starting point with medical device development process is intended use. It is important to get the intended use right. It is a description of user profile, indications of what the device is intended for, patient group, and other relevant conditions of use as intended by the developer. One way of coming up with intended use is asking questions such as who will use the device, on whom will the device be used, what will the device be used for, when and where. Answering these questions will define the intended use. Now let's have a look at the user needs. User needs should describe what the user needs, and this should be aligned with the intended use. An example for this would be that the device should be light in weight and portable. Once the user needs has been established, they need to be translated into design input. Design input is the technical requirement that realizes the user need when implemented in the design. An example for this would be that the device weight should not exceed 2 kg. It is very important to translate the user needs into design inputs. You need to make sure that the product you came up with meets the requirements defined in the beginning. This is a regulatory requirement for medical device development. You need to confirm that the design output meets the design input. This process is called design verification. Different methods can be used for design verification. Either testing, team reviews, demonstration, to ensure that the requirements have been met. Once the verification has been done, you also need to check that the design meets the intended use. This process is called design validation. The validation process or testing can be conducted in the real or simulated environment to demonstrate that the intended user needs have been fulfilled. The reason for this is that a product can be technically 100% correct but useless in a real setting. To avoid this, you need to perform a design validation. To conduct a product validation, production units can be used. This is a regulatory requirement. Sometimes clinical testing can be performed for design validation. We have developed a flow diagram for development process. The purpose of this flow diagram is to define the procedure followed by PDTS in controlling the integration of design inputs, activities, outputs, and to direct the design transfer to the limit 1 production. This flow diagram is applicable to all design or development work done by PDTS, when new products are designed or developed to meet the market or the specific customer requirements. This document also directs the design of safe medical devices. The following documents were used as guideline in the establishment of this flow diagram. Medical Device Directive. The Medical Device Directive is intended to harmonize the laws relating to medical devices within the European Union. Medical Device Quality Management Systems. This is requirements for regulatory purposes, the ISO 13485. This flow diagram allows us to go in depth with some of the development processes that were already defined. This is design input, design planning, organizational and technical interface, design verification, design validation, design output, design transfer, production transfer review. Now let's go in depth with design and development input. Formally starting a project is referred to as initiation. It is a short phase where feasibility study is conducted. It is documented in the project charter. There is no formal requirement for initiation stage. It is a record as to when and how the project was started. It is a standard requirement in the initiation phase for PDTS and NetLine to meet to determine the minimum requirements and the project scope. Once the project scope has been determined, an engineer shall study medical device and related literature in search for new developments and will be in close contact with the customer to identify market requirements and needs. Competitor products, both local and overseas, shall continuously be evaluated to determine if there is a potential to develop a similar product or better on an existing design. The purpose for this is to stay on the forefront of technological development. A thorough patent search and a risk assessment will be completed and collected during a feasibility study. A technical feasibility study is conducted to determine if the product can be developed and manufactured in terms of technical competency and capability. It will determine if the product can be developed and manufactured cost effectively, and all the potential risk involved in the application and manufacturing of the product should be highlighted in the feasibility study. Applicable requirements, standards, and guidelines should be verified and documented in the feasibility study. The feasibility study must be reviewed, and the result will determine the continuation of the project. If the feasibility and risk results are not acceptable, the project would be stopped, and if they are accepted, then a design history file will be opened. The acceptance of the projects lead to a concept and technology design. A developer shall develop concepts by making use of various design configurations until the design satisfied the input requirements and specifications. All steps in the development process will be documented. Design calculations should be documented for later reviews. Once the design is complete, all drawings, sketches, and specifications should be numbered internally, and an internal revision number should be assigned to it. Once the drawings are approved by the client, a drawing number or document number shall be assigned to it. Test protocols should be developed to test, evaluate, and validate all the product requirements and design characteristics. The prototype should be inspected or tested against the standards and specifications. The product developer will document the detailed product specifications based on the design input, international standard, and good engineering practices. The interfaces with other devices like your instruments should be defined and documented. Quality requirements should be investigated and also documented. Where necessary, a patent registration will be done on the product or the concept. It is of most importance to define manufacturing or source manufacturing subcontracting. Therefore, a suitable manufacturing strategy for prototyping or outsourced manufacturers will be sourced, an NDA signed, and service level agreement signed if necessary. A cost model will be documented to ensure the development financial objectives are met. Once the technical aspects of the design and organizational interfaces is complete, a design review needs to be done. A technical design review shall be done on the concept design and all associated documentation and drawings, as well as the agreement with outsourced manufacturing companies. In the case where the design review is not acceptable, it's either the project will be stopped completely or the developer will have to redo the design concept, define protocols, source manufacturing, and another design review will have to be conducted. Once the design is accepted, the prototype design should be updated when necessary and shall be finalized as input to prototype manufacturing. Where applicable, prototypes should be manufactured in accordance with the design drawings and concept manufacturing procedures. Now, process and quality requirements are considered during the prototype manufacturing process. The developer shall design the concept process for manufacturing and inspection of the prototype under development with the outsourced manufacturing company. All concept work instruction, inspection, and test instruction, etc. should be. The manufacturing requirements in respect of the following elements will be considered and recorded. Facilities required, equipment required, machinery required, processes required, inspection and testing equipment required, workmanship standard required, manpower and skill, cleaning method required, packaging method required, etc. Work instructions required for process control should be defined and documented. The quality requirements for the product should be defined and adopted from published standards and guidelines. Important parameters such as clearance, tolerances, special material, relevant standards and specifications, etc. must be defined to ensure that all the quality requirements needed for the reliable functioning of the prototype are specified. Inspections and test instructions required for the first of inspection, in processes final inspection, including testing, should be developed. Once all these aspects have been documented, the final prototype should be manufactured and the manufacturing equipment and manufacturing instructions will be evaluated. With the acceptance of design verification, a design done on manufacturing processes such as Limit 1 injection molding or sheet metal and tubing. Now that a critical design review has been done and we are sure about the manufacturing processes, a design validation needs to be conducted, an establishment of a clinical evaluation protocol and instruction for use, followed by a clinical evaluation research and clinical evaluation report. The clinical evaluation report is followed by the clinical investigation, where the prototype is tested in a clinical environment. An operational test shall be done to do a final product validation and instruction manual. All the clinical investigation evaluation is done to verify that the design or the product meets the intended use. This process is basically called the design validation. The design validation process or testing can be conducted in a real or simulated environment to demonstrate that the intended user needs have been fulfilled. As explained earlier, the reason for this is that a product can be technically 100% correct but useless in a real setting. To avoid this, a design validation needs to be conducted. Once the user needs have been fulfilled, or rather, the design validation is accepted, transfer needs to be done. Document procedure for transfer of design and development outputs to manufacturing should be defined, like manufacturing and quality plan, training plan, etc. These procedures should ensure that the design and development outputs are verified as suitable before becoming final production specifications, and that production capability can meet the product requirements. Finally, with a safe and functional medical device, a review should be held to review the development documentation, the design output against the design input requirements, and the development input and output review should be completed. It is very possible for the production readiness review to be rejected, and the developer will have to perform a redesign and validation. And the acceptance of the production readiness review will lead to manufacturing. Once the manufacturing is done, final testing inspection by an ISO certified 13485 company or competent test and inspection company. If that is accepted, then the product will be delivered to supply chain. All these concepts is a broken down product development process for a safe and functional medical device. Now, my colleague Carol Plaka will look into industrialization. Thank you very much.
Thank you, colleagues. Now we get to the part where we talk about industrialization. So where are we in the product development process? We have explored the problem and we think we understand it. We have looked for solutions with the understanding of the problem, and we have started to realize our solution. The last step is to launch our product onto the market. But you will see on the slide, we first have to bridge the gap. Bridging the gap requires a lot of planning, and there are also a lot of risks involved. We at the PDTS have discovered that the highest risk is the cost of setting up the manufacturing of your product. There are a few ways in which you can reduce the risk, which we will discuss a bit later. In the next slides, we will discuss the different manufacturing processes which can be used when developing your product. The first manufacturing process we'll talk about is subtractive manufacturing. This is also the most commonly known and used process throughout the industry. Subtractive manufacturing requires a lot of material. How you start with subtractive manufacturing is with a large volume of a certain material. This can be steel, aluminium, or even plastic. You would take a large blank billet and you would remove material from it to get your end product. On the slide you can see a few examples of subtractive manufacturing processes. In the top left corner we have a mill. The image to the right of that is a lathe, and at the bottom of the slide there's an image of a CNC laser cutter. There are a lot of advanced subtractive manufacturing processes, and most of these processes are controlled by computers and are very accurate. The high cost of subtractive manufacturing comes in with the material. You have to buy a large amount of material to produce your parts. A large part of the cost of subtractive manufacturing also goes into the setup of the machine and the setup of the material when you start manufacturing. These costs can be reduced, but ultimately they are fixed. And you would have to look at other ways of producing your part. The next manufacturing process is additive manufacturing, and it works in exactly the opposite way as subtractive manufacturing. Parts are created by adding layers on top of layers to create your final part. Additive manufacturing uses a lot less material as there is no waste, or at least a reduced amount of waste material. Additive manufacturing is also very accurate, perhaps a bit more accurate than subtractive manufacturing, but ultimately subtractive manufacturing and additive manufacturing will give you a high amount of accuracy on your parts. There are a few different processes of additive manufacturing. In the top left corner you can see a fuse deposition modeling example. FDM printing is also a very cost-effective way of prototyping inexpensive parts. In my experience, this printing can be used as a visual representation of your final product, but you will not get a real representation of a working prototype. That can be done on the next process, which is selective laser sintering, and that is the image to the right. How selective laser sintering works is powder is inserted into a bed of a 3D printing machine. The powder is then melted down at specific points by a high power laser. The image shown is actually the laser exposing on the material, and it is melting the powder molecules together. SLS printing is also very accurate, and you can get a great representation of a working prototype. The process is a bit expensive, and actually a lot more expensive than FDM printing. The next process is stereolithography, and that is the image to the bottom. SLA printing uses a liquid resin. This liquid resin is hardened by either a laser or a UV light, depending on the machine you use. SLA printing is used for visual representations of prototypes, but also working prototypes. SLA printing also reduces the amount of material lost due to supports being inserted on the print. SLA printing is also a very great representation of very smooth lines, as the surface finish is excellent, and in my opinion the best of the three processes shown on the screen. The last manufacturing process I would like to talk about is injection molding. Now, injection molding is used to create small plastic parts. While most of the plastic parts we see around us in our daily lives are actually manufactured with injection molders. To the top of the slide you can see an example of an injection molding machine. Just below that is a basic diagram of all the components making up the machine. So how does this machine work? Well, we buy small plastic pellets and we insert them into the hopper. These small plastic pellets are moved forward by a screw or an auger towards the heater bands. These heater bands heat up the plastic and melt them down. They are then injected with great pressures into a mold cavity. Now, as I said, great pressures are involved, so these are really large machines with large hydraulic systems to clamp the two parts of the mold together with great force. So I've mentioned a mold. To the right of the slide you will see an example of a mold. You will see its two halves and the final object is between them. So a mold is actually two metal blocks which come together, and on the inside there is a cavity of the final part. These molds can either be manufactured from metal blocks or plastic, if you would like to do so. The metal blocks are mostly manufactured using subtractive manufacturing processes. And this is where that large monetary risk comes in, which we talked about earlier. These molds can cost upwards of 800,000 Rand, and I'm really not exaggerating that amount of money. It really also depends on the size of your part and the mold, but ultimately it costs a lot of money. We at the PDTS have researched this part of the product development process a lot, and we have discovered a few ways in which we can reduce the risk. This slide shows two product development processes. The top process is the, if I can say, industry standard process being followed today. Engineers would start off with a CAD design. They would then prototype their design with an FDM print. As I mentioned, this is a very inexpensive way of creating a visual representation of your product. You will see the arrows are moving from the FDM print to the CAD design and vice versa. So this is an iterative process. If you have completed your CAD design and you are happy with it, you can then move on to an SLS print. This is where you would prototype a working prototype of your product. This you can use to show your client, or as a client, you can show this to investors for possible funding. If you receive funding or you are satisfied with the product, you then have to move on to injection mold tooling. And as I mentioned, this is where the high cost lies. You will have to pay 800,000 Rand to create that metal tool, because you will have to send your product for market trials or clinical trials in the manufacturing process which your product will be manufactured in, and the materials of the commercialized product. If you at this point discover that your product does not conform to the clinical trials or the market trials, you are then out of pocket 800,000 Rand, and the development has to stop or start over again from your CAD designs. I also should mention that injection molding is not an easy process, and there can be a few changes to your mold afterward. So we have researched this, as I have mentioned, and we came up with the next development process. You start off with CAD design and you 3D print just like in the top process. But we utilize rapid tooling before we move to injection mold tooling. Now, what is rapid tooling? Rapid tooling is the creation of an injection mold tool with additive manufacturing. As I mentioned, additive manufacturing have a few processes which you can utilize, as well as different materials. So with your rapid tool created, you can then shoot a few samples of your final part in the final process, which is injection molding, and the final materials which can be used for market trials or clinical trials. And you can also sort out all of your molding challenges. Now, why is this better? Well, there's a great price difference between a rapid tool and a large steel mass-produced injection mold tool. As I said, injection mold tools can cost upwards of 8,000 Rand. Well, a large rapid tool in nylon can cost you round about 10,000 Rand. So your monetary risk is greatly reduced. So you have created your rapid tool, you have done your trials, you've sorted out all your molding challenges. You can then use the few samples you have to actually go to the market and test out the market. If you see that you have been selling your product and sales are perhaps rising and you need more products, you can then move on to large-scale injection mold tooling from steel tools. So you actually have a few Rand in your pocket to use for these tools. If you perhaps do a market trial and you see that your product is not selling, unfortunately, you actually have the advantage of now only being 10,000 Rand out of pocket instead of 800,000 Rand. And that seems to me as a great deal. This slide shows the rapid tooling process. To the bottom left, you can see the CAD design of the mold. To the top of that, you will see a table full of white plastic nylon molds. Now, we actually don't like to brag about this, but that is actually 14 iterations of one mold, which was created within 2 weeks at the PDTS offices. Now, this was done during the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic lockdown in South Africa. And this product was a PPE mask for the Department of Health in the Free State. So they really needed a quick product which they can supply to their frontline workers. So the deadline was really tight. Now, as I said, we don't like to brag about this because a lot of overtime also went into this development, and we don't want that to become the industry standard. But this just shows that it can be done. 14 molds can be produced within 2 weeks through rapid tooling. Now, to the bottom of that picture, you will see an aluminium insert being manufactured. Now, with rapid tooling, you cannot solely rely on additive manufacturing to create your molds. There will still be some subtractive manufacturing to be produced. So, in my opinion, there will never be a future where you can solely produce a mold with additive manufacturing. To the right of these pictures is the final product, and that is actually the mask which was delivered to the Department of Health and which were used by the frontline workers. It should be mentioned that the quantity required by the Department of Health did not exceed the lifetime of the mold. Otherwise, this would have been another picture. We would have done 14 iterations of the rapid tool, trialed the product, and then create a steel tool which we can then use for mass production of these masks. Luckily, this was not necessary, and we could only use our nylon molds to create this product.
Good day, colleagues. My name is Thabo Lengwe, and I'm a mechanical engineer at the Product Development Technology Station. I would like to share a bit on some of the projects we have done at the PDTS. I'll be discussing the journeys of the projects from start to end, intending to demonstrate how the development process being discussed by my colleagues was used to undertake this project. The first project is the patient-specific dynamic hand splint. But before we can dwell on the development of the dynamic hand splint, the importance of the hand should be highlighted. A functional hand is a prerequisite for the optimal performance of all activities of daily living that make it possible to meaningfully fulfill one's roles and tasks. The hand is a complex structure that integrates basic abilities such as muscle strength, range of movement, sensation, proprioception to perform both simple and complex fine and coarse motor tasks. In the case of impairment in a normal function of the hand, participation in daily tasks is still possible, but requires the implementation of suitable assistive devices that facilitate function. It is essential that these devices compensate for the specific impairment but does not negatively impact other basic abilities. The figures on the slide show the difference between a normal hand and an impaired hand. On the left, it's a normal functioning hand, and on the right, it's a hand with impairments, whether due to degenerative diseases, stroke, or tendon injuries we face in every activity we do daily. So, to get back to how the project came about, Dr. Franz Kleinhans, based in Bloemfontein and specializes in orthopedics, has a wealth of experience in the field. He approached the PDTS with the idea to develop a patient-specific dynamic hand splint using additive manufacturing processes due to the limitless possibilities of outcomes one can achieve with 3D printing. The first step to start with the project, or any other project, was to draft the specifications based on the client's expected outcome. The specifications helped us as the engineers to filter out what was the most critical elements of the hand splint and what was just aesthetics that can be addressed on a later stage of the development. This is part of the development where we ask ourselves, why the patient-specific dynamic hand splint? Why do we want to move away from the conventional methods being used currently? What are the manufacturing processes we intend to use? Do we have the know-how of the technology intending to use? The reason you ask yourself all these questions is to narrow down the path in which the development will take. By that, it doesn't mean it's set in stone or you can deviate from the drafted or chosen path. The next part about product development is the reiterative process used until the desired outcomes have been achieved. The reason for the patient-specific dynamic hand splint was to address the adverse effects of having standard dynamic hand splints limited to just a few sizes: the small, medium, large, and extra large if needed. Another reason is the lead time it takes to conventionally fabricate a patient's specific dynamic hand splint using conventional methods, and also not forgetting the price tags that comes with it. Upon finalizing the specifications of the project, the actual designs of the hand splint started. Of course, you cannot just dive in and start 3D modeling on CAD, but extensive research was done on the project and the clinical input from Dr. Kleinhans was very helpful. Our engineers started to conceptualize the product with the intent to first get the functionality of the hand splint sorted out. Once that was done, we had to take into consideration the complex ergonomics of the hand and produce a product that will fit to a specific patient's hands as comfortable as possible. We had to measure all critical dimensions of the hand shape that will influence the CAD. By that, I mean the hard part was upon us. There are about 15 measurements of each finger that had to be recorded. The figure on the left shows how measurements were recorded during the development, and the figure on the right is a chart that was made to capture the data at a later stage of the development. The reason for the chart is to have a specific dynamic hand splint that we can take to market, but instead of users having to come to the PDTS every time for measurements and CAD designs, the patients can go to a clinical practitioner who will be able to take measurements accurately and complete the measurement charts. This will be in a Microsoft Excel format and can be populated on a website created. The website can take the measurements and insert them into a CAD software that will be able to change the default dynamic hand splint model to meet the desired measurements. The user will get a 3D printing file format that they can take to any 3D printing facilities to print for them. The process is time effective and the turnaround time is estimated to be around 2 to 3 days, reducing the time from conventional fabrication by over 60%. The figure shows the different designs that was printed and tested along the development process until the desired one was created. Like mentioned before, product development is an iterative process. For the patient-specific dynamic hand splint, there were about 10 revisions that had to be made for the hand splint fingers. The reason for this was to try out different designs by using live hinges and exploiting the mechanical properties of 3D printed nylon parts to achieve the spring back you'll get on a normal hand splint. The final prototype was designed and printed with the actual measurements of the recipient of the hand splint. The patient was identified by Dr. Kleinhans from a local hospital. This was the beginning of the field test for one-of-a-kind patient-specific dynamic hand splint. The figure shows the complete assembly of the hand splint before it was shipped and ready for its new user. The clinical feedback received from the patient and the clinical practitioners was very positive. 2 more prototypes were made for different recipients to further test the product. The product is now ready for market and many more recipients are going to benefit from the product. This is a picture of the dynamic hand splint being used in the intended environment. The hand splint was a perfect fit and it was comfortable. At the same time, it became easy to produce in a timely manner. The sustainable 3-in-1 wheelchair is one of the successful products to come out of the PDTS. African countries such as South Africa face a large problem concerning the mobility of persons with disability in rural areas. To supply the large need of people in rural areas, the government and organizations import cheap, basic folding wheelchairs. These wheelchairs seldom come with or have available spare parts. This is concerning as these wheelchairs are not intended for the environmental challenges faced by African disabled persons. The rural mobility wheelchair, as seen on the figures, aim to build a sustainable, reliable solution to improve the mobility of persons with disability in rural areas. The wheelchair features an attachable hand cycle or free wheel to help with mobility and reliability of wheelchairs in rural areas and long-distance traveling. A person with disability will have a reliable wheelchair to move around indoors, but has an attachable hand cycle or free will to improve mobility on rough rural roads and over long distances. How it came about: Mr. Schalk van der Merwe being a wheelchair user for over 25 years and actively being involved in wheelchair racing and handbike racing. Schalk has a lot of experience in the field of wheelchairs and the use of them. In 1995, building himself an aluminium racing wheelchair as he could not afford the imported chairs. The chair handled well and competed in many races. Other people with disabilities saw the chair and from there on built about 55 of these racing wheelchairs from his garage. He has a passion for solving mobility problems in low-income areas. Approaching the PDTS, the project aimed to be an African mobility solution for the African need. Schalk, having been awarded funding from SAB for the development of the wheelchair, approached the PDTS to refine his wheelchair design and prototype to become more industrial and market ready. During the development, furthermore funding was needed for the project, and the PDTS applied for the tier major funding to improve the prototype. The PDTS came up with multiple designs and prototypes through testing and implementations based on the feedback received from clinical practitioners and working hand in hand with Schalk, who has vast experience with wheelchairs. The wheelchairs is currently in field testing. The figures shown is the final version of the prototype that was sent to Zimbabwe for field testing. The PDTS was approached by Mr. Bottomley, who runs an NGO from Harare and was very interested in obtaining the wheelchairs to test them on the harshest terrains in Africa. The feedback received was very positive, and currently 20 units of the wheelchairs are being manufactured at the PDTS workshop to carry out further testing of the wheelchairs. Below is a video of one of the wheelchairs that was ever produced from the PDTS and was donated to a person with disability.
In 1991, I was involved in a motor car accident, which left me in a wheelchair. 2017, I entered a competition run by SA Breweries. I entered a rural handbike that I've designed. In the rural areas, you've got gravel roads, so it's very difficult to use a wheelchair. Mr. Mzwakhe Moqhaisa was one of the people that received one of our rural wheelchairs. And the nice story about Mr. Michael is that I spoke to his sons the other day and they were very excited because it's the first time in 18 years that they don't have to push their dad around in his wheelchair anymore. Michael now has the freedom to go wherever he wants. Actually, this is where the big breakthrough came. It's from SA Breweries, because I used that money to develop this chair, and now I can change lives as my life was changed.
Persons with disabilities currently enrolled in schools in Bloemfontein have no wheelchair rugby league or development program. There is no development program in South Africa. This is unfortunate, as wheelchair rugby allows persons with most disabilities to compete. Allowing persons with disabilities to compete against able-bodied persons at the same level of performance. The main reason for these development barriers is the high cost of rugby wheelchairs. Currently, a cost-effective development project is in progress where rugby wheelchairs are produced locally by persons with disabilities. Empowering people with disabilities with the knowledge and skills to be able to manufacture wheelchairs will promote their state of occupational injustice by allowing them to be part of the open labor market, leading to the feeling of belonging and well-being. The project aims to uplift people in the disabled community by providing skills, development, and employment. They will feel needed and that they are still valuable in the community. These wheelchairs will be manufactured for disabled athletes by persons with disabilities. A pilot workshop has been set up at the Product Development Technology Station, employing 2 persons with different disabilities. The current workshop can produce 20 rugby wheelchairs per month. The wheelchairs produced from the process will have a large impact on the wheelchair rugby community. The aim is to grow this into a full-scale factory producing disabled sports equipment for persons with disabilities.
Commercialization and opportunities that exist within South Africa. With a public and rapidly growing private health sector, South Africa has one of the most dynamic healthcare sectors in the world. This generates many opportunities for development and manufacturing companies where they can offer innovative technologies to meet healthcare needs. According to the South African Medical Device Industry Association, domestic medical device manufacturers are able to meet 50% of demand in volume terms. South Africa's domestic medical device industry remains underdeveloped, with imports catering for 90% of the market by value. South Africa's medical device production firms tend to be small or medium-sized businesses and often combine distribution activity in manufacturing. The South African government is committed to implementing universal healthcare, and market growth will likely be influenced by the government's National Healthcare Insurance Program and increased spending on healthcare. The private healthcare sector is very sophisticated, with world-class facilities and healthcare provision, and offers a good prospect for advanced technology and equipment. There is little local manufacture, and the majority of equipment and devices are imported, mainly from the United States, but also from Germany, China, Switzerland, UK, and Japan. In both sectors, aging and growing population, including chronic diseases, combined with financial restraints, are demanding innovation, high-tech solutions to the increasing healthcare demand. The projected areas of growth in the medical device in South Africa includes universal healthcare and NHI, vertical integrated of large healthcare providers, medical equipment and devices, radiological equipment, surgical technology, dental equipment, and diabetes.
In the previous slides, I also mentioned clinical trials. Now, clinical trials are only applicable on medical devices. Now, seeing as a PDTS is a medical device technology station, I would like to talk about medical device registration a bit further. Now, if you have a medical device and you want to sell it in South Africa, that product will have to be registered by SAHPRA. Now, SAHPRA is a South African health products regulatory authority, and they regulate all of the products on the market. So to get your device certified by SAHPRA, your device will have to be designed by a company who is ISO 13485 certified. So my colleagues have spoken about the ISO 13485 product development process. But there are also a few directives from SAHPRA to which you should conform before your part or product can be certified by them. Now the same goes for products right across the world. If you want to sell a product in the European Union, it will have to have a CE mark. Now, to obtain a CE mark, your product must conform to a certain directive. And there are three main directives: Directive 90, 93, and 98. Directive 90 deals with active implantable medical devices. So these are medical devices which are implanted into your body which use electricity. Now, Directive 93 deals with medical devices, and these can be any and all medical devices. Directive 98 deals with in vitro diagnostic medical devices. So these are devices that perhaps penetrate your skin to diagnose a certain illness. Now, within these directives, there are certain rules and regulations to which your product should conform. And if they do not, your product will not be CE marked, and it will be illegal to sell that medical device within the borders of the European Union. The same goes for the United States of America. If you would like to sell a medical device in the US, it will have to be FDA approved. Now, a product can either be FDA approved or FDA cleared. Now, a cleared product is actually a class 1 or class 2 device. Now these are devices which are for external use and they are classified as a low risk. Now FDA approved are for all devices which have a higher risk. So to obtain FDA approval, the device must conform to Regulation 21. Now Regulation 21 is actually the Code of Federal Regulations Title 21, and there are a few parts in that code. Now the most important parts are Part 11, which talk about electronic records. You have Part 807, the establishment, registration and listing. Part 807 subpart E, pre-market notification. And Part 814, pre-market approval application. Part 812, investigational device exemption. And Part 820, quality management and quality management system regulations. Now, medical device registration should really be left to the professionals. But as an entrepreneur, it should be known that there are certain regulations, and setting up a product development process and a medical device file to conform to all of these directives and CFR parts takes some time. And it also requires a lot of money. So before designing a medical device, please be sure to think about the time spent and also the money spent to produce this part and also to put this part onto the market. Another aspect of the product development process which is not well known by clients is intellectual property. Now, intellectual property is governed by the Intellectual Property Rights Act. And any and all intellectual property should be registered with the National Intellectual Property Management Office, or NIPMO. Now, what is intellectual property? In layman's terms, intellectual property is any novel idea of a product or a process which can be shown that it is not seen anywhere else in the world. There are a few ways in which you can manage your intellectual property, looking at commercialization, but I will discuss that a bit later in the slide. This slide shows a table with a few representations of technology station programs, contracting parties, and if the IPR Act applies. Now, this table is applicable for South African citizens whose project has been funded by public finances. Now, public finances are funds which are distributed to clients through the Technology Innovation Agency, or TIA, or perhaps a CEDA fund. Now, TIA has a lot of funding programs, but the three common programs are shown here. The first one is TSP, that is a Technology Station Program. And the contracting party can either be a SMME or an individual. And in both cases, the IPR Act applies. Now, a TSP is funds which is allocated to a technology station. So, for instance, a PDTS has a certain amount of money it should spend to subsidize projects of clients. And these clients can be, as I mentioned, SMMEs or individuals. Now, how does this work? The technology station would identify certain projects which fall within their core competencies. For the product development technology station, this would be medical devices or small plastic products. The station would then, with the approval of the client, subsidize a percentage of the cost of the project. Now, the client can opt to pay in full for the entire project. In that case, the client would own all the intellectual property. But it should be mentioned that if the technology station subsidizes R1 of the total cost, the IP would be owned by the technology station. Another funding program is YTIP, or the Youth Technology Innovation Program. Now, once again, a company can apply for funding. It can be an individual as well. Now, a company who pays full cost for the project, the IPR Act does not apply. So, as I mentioned, if a company pays for the full amount of the project costs, the intellectual property will be solely owned by the company. But if you are an individual and you pay for the full cost of the project, the IPR Act will apply and the intellectual property will be owned by the technology station. If you are a company and the cost of the project exceeds the full cost of the funds available, the IPR Act applies and the IP will be owned by the technology station. The last funding program I'd like to talk about is a seed fund. Now, a seed fund is applied by the technology station to TIA. So you can only receive funding through a higher education institution or through a regional funding agency. And in both cases, the IPR Act applies. So, as mentioned, if the Act applies, the intellectual property is owned by the technology station. In the case of a seed fund, it will be owned by the HEI or the RFA. So this sounds really unfair. Why would the technology station or the HEI, like CT, take all the intellectual property if you came up with the idea? Well, actually, the highest risk lies in developing that idea to a product. And the Technology Innovation Agency, or TIA, or the technology station and the HEI takes on that risk. They say, okay, you have a good idea, I would like to invest my money in this idea, but as I am giving you money, I would like to receive some money back if this actually works out and your product is commercialized. So there will be royalties payable to the person or institution who owns the intellectual property. Now, this is actually not a big problem. As I said, as a client, your risk is reduced. You don't have to pay any money towards the development of your product. And you will only have to pay a small percentage of the income of that company to the institution who owns the IP. We always like to tell clients that the money does not lie in intellectual property. I will come to the only exception to that rule in a moment, but the money does not lie there. The money lies in the licensing out of that intellectual property. Now, if it is your intellectual property, or your idea which you started out with, you are seen as a designer, and the intellectual property will most likely be licensed out to you. And only, as I mentioned, a small percentage will be payable to the institution who owns the intellectual property. Now, the exception to this rule is patents. If you have an idea and you would like to patent it with no consideration to commercialization or no need for commercialization, you would like to own the IP. You would then develop that idea, register a patent for that idea, and sell the patent to perhaps a competing or rival company. Now, in that case, you would have to own all of the intellectual property. Otherwise, you would still have to pay a certain amount of the income that you received from the selling of that patent to the institution who owns the intellectual property. So, as a client, you should differentiate between what your end goals would be. Would it be selling a patent, or will it be commercializing a product? So if you have done this, if you have decided which route to take, and you have already decided which funding route to take, and you have in the back of your mind the thought that your medical device will have to be registered, or it will have to be manufactured with an ISO process, either 13485 or 9001. You are an engineer's dream. So, to all the prospective clients out there, please remember those three things: IP, ISO, and funding.
Thank you very much for your time.